Howdy. I love that. I'm Raymond Robertson. I'm the director of the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy here at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. I'd like to welcome you very warmly to Policing on Drugs, a book talk with Professor Aileen Teague, which promises to be an exciting discussion and offer very valuable insights about Dr. Teague's newly released book and addressing the history and origins of the militarized war against drugs in the United States and Mexico. I want to thank you so much to all of you for coming this evening. We're so glad to have you with us. I know several of you are coming to lots of our events. It's so great to see you again. And to those of you who haven't been to one of our events previously, we hope you feel very welcome and hope you feel at home here. This is really an opportunity for you to join in to the conversation. We appreciate your participation in the conversation that follows. We're especially honored, I have to say, to have Dr. Teague's family and friends joining us this evening. So I want to thank you so much. I know that you're proud of her, not as proud as we are of her, but we're sure you're very proud as well. For those of you who don't know Professor Teague, here at the Mosbacher Institute, we've been incredibly lucky to have her as a colleague and be able to collaborate with her in several ways. She's a Mosbacher Institute Fellow and organizer of our Other Side of the Border Speaker Series, which has been incredibly successful in so many different ways. And she's also been the coordinator of our Borders and Migration Program, which obviously here in Texas is very important, but also increasingly throughout the public discourse nationally. This program tries to promote multidisciplinary research on the impacts of migration and economic border flows. And I will say, if you haven't been to one of those events, it's really great to have those events because Aileen has done an amazing job of pulling together academics and also practitioners to have very practical, real-life conversations about what the real issues are, striving for solutions. And I've just been incredibly lucky to have her working on that project. So thank you again, you've been amazing. For those of you who don't know, Assistant Professor Aileen Teague joined the Bush School's Department of International Affairs as an assistant professor in the fall of 2020. She previously held a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. She got her Ph.D. in history from Vanderbilt University in 2018. She was originally born in Colón, Panama, which I think contributed to her interest in Latin America, I'm not sure, but traveled the world as part of a military family and then served herself in the Marine Corps from 2006 to 2014. Here at the Bush School, she teaches classes on American history and U.S. relations with Mexico and Latin America, as well as thematic courses addressing issues such as interventionism, drug enforcement, national security, and addiction in U.S. society. She really enjoys, you can tell through her teaching, and the students rave about her as well, how she does a great job providing a voice on how history comes alive and has really shaped the current social and political issues. It's really an honor for the Mosbacher Institute and for me as well to host this event this evening to promote her new book. Thank you very much, Dr. Teague. Please come on up.
Get this out of the way, and I think that the microphone on. We're good? Okay, fantastic. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to share in the joy that is having the baby that is the book that I've been working on for so long finally come out, and I've spoken to many of you about it because it was a slow process, but I really appreciate you sharing in this with me. I especially want to welcome my family, my husband, Zach, who traveled in from Austin to be part of this event, as well as friends, colleagues, and to our students here at the Bush School for coming to the event. I am grateful to the Mosbacher Institute for its steadfast support of my work. Raymond and Jennifer, collaborating with you all has been one of the most enjoyable aspects of my work here at the Bush School. And I'm also thankful to the Bush Library for hosting us tonight, who was going to continue to host us tonight, government shutdown or not, so I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Tonight, I am excited to share with you my research on the origins of U.S. drug enforcement policies and their unintended effects in Mexico. And I'm largely speaking from a historical perspective. And any questions you have, we'll have some time at the end to talk about some of these things. So let's start, and hopefully all this is working here. There it is. So let's start in February 1977. U.S. Consul General Ruth Matthews in Mazatlan, Sinaloa, reported to Washington, D.C., the devastation caused by Operation Condor, which was Mexico's U.S.-backed herbicidal drug eradication program. It ran from 1976 until the early 1980s, and Operation Condor marked one of the first American efforts to use U.S. aircraft to destroy drug abuse literally at its root, at its source, using chemicals. But while U.S. officials focused on the aerial aspects of the campaign, Condor unleashed a number of consequences on the ground, vividly documented in Consul General Matthews' reports back to Washington, D.C. So, I mean, here's an example here. Soldiers are now very much in evidence through Mazatlan streets, she wrote back. On some days, whole avenues are cordoned off so the military can conduct raids on suspected traffickers. And so, I mean, I've looked at hundreds of reports like this, and what Matthews was describing and observing seemed to be more or less a military conflict zone. And so by 1969, nearly 7 years earlier, the US had pressured Mexico, whose traffickers had begun supplying marijuana and heroin to US markets, to intensify their counter-narcotics efforts with US assistance. What Washington wanted in Mexico was a modern, technologically driven program modeled on the defoliation campaigns that the United States had conducted in Vietnam. Mexico accepted limited aid, but they resisted in using these chemicals for nearly 7 years. But by 1975, however, US heroin overdose rates had spiked, and stalling on the program proved untenable. And so Operation Condor soon followed. It was a measure intended to curb US drug use, but in the end, it only made marginal impacts on our domestic drug consumption here in the United States, and instead, it deepened violence in Mexico. And so I'm going to return to this thread in just a few minutes. Nearly 30 years later, Mexico's President Felipe Calderón, again with American support, pursued a militarized campaign against drug trafficking organizations, triggering the wave of violence widely recognized south of the border today. And so I use this sort of as a hook and an entry point into the project, because there are striking continuities between anti-drug strategies of the 1970s and those of the 21st century. First, more militarized enforcement had no corresponding effect on US overdose rates at home. Second, militarized policing increased Mexican instability. And so this graph here shows how homicide rates escalated sharply in 2007 following Calderón's military escalation. And third, although Mexico and the United States adopted militarized drug policies, their relations eventually deteriorated. And so one notable example being the DEA's 2020 arrest of former Mexican Defense Minister Salvador Cienfuegos at LAX airport for his alleged involvement in the drug trade, which we actually just talked about today in my US-Mexico class. This undermined productive dialogue and produced mutual mistrust between Mexico and the United States. So the question is, why does militarized drug control remain so relevant when it's proven so ineffective? Or framed as the main questions I aim to answer in the book, and I kind of go back to kind of the granular level here, asking what motives did the US and Mexico have for punitive drug enforcement policies? What were the impacts, and what was the role of each and both the United States in producing this outcome? As a historian, I would say that these rather short-sighted narratives that we see in the media or in airport bookstores, these sensationalized accounts of the drug trade, trace contemporary Mexico's contemporary drug war to the Felipe Calderón years, framing it as a reaction to cartel violence or infighting. My research reveals a deeper history rooted in US and Mexican policing traditions and the structural limits of state control. In other words, Mexico's drug war is not a 21st century anomaly, but part of a longer trajectory of militarized policing that repeatedly failed to achieve its aims. And so my project situates the evolution of more intensive bilateral security and anti-drug policies within the broader state-building efforts inside Mexico. So while the focus of the book is, of course, our southern neighbor, the topic seems applicable well outside of Mexico. Recent military actions in the Caribbean and elsewhere, where militaries have targeted boats, aircraft, and criminals, show how the drug trade and public insecurity continues to be framed as a threat to our national security in one way or another. This is a complex debate. I won't lie to you there. Where advocates claim military force delivers battlefield wins and makes measurable impacts against criminal networks. However, these tactics have carried serious risks of escalation, and this is what my project aims to really kind of tease out. While many still ponder whether the United States should militarize the drug war, and here I mean everything on the continuum from the DEA operating extrajudicially in Mexico to US naval strikes, policing on drugs reminds us that we already have militarized our drug control, and the results were negligible and it produced unintended consequences. And so like the iconic 1987 public service announcement, "This is your brain on drugs," which I don't know if many of you have seen that, if you remember, with the fried egg, which uses a fried egg to visualize the harmful effects of drugs. My take here is that our security and policing strategies, when on drugs, have equally damaging effects domestically and abroad. And so to understand Mexico's drug war, we must look back to US policy choices. American leaders externalize drug control, meaning they prioritize supply control abroad over demand reduction at home, and this is largely continues today. This militarized export began with President Richard Nixon's war on drugs during the 1970s and deepened under successive presidential administrations. Concurrently, though, Mexican political violence profoundly shaped how the government implemented US mandated drug enforcement in Mexico. In the 1970s, as the US poured millions of dollars into Mexico's anti-drug campaign, the Mexican government diverted many of these resources to fight its own internal war between the ruling Institutional Revolutionary Party, which I'll call the PRI, or PRI, and perceived leftist dissidents and guerrilla groups. Scholars call this period La Guerra Sucia, or Dirty War, which lasted between the 1950s and the 1980s. The book tells the story of how US and Mexican leaders framed drug control within a militarized policing model, expanding military power and enforcement over time. Yet their motives diverged. Washington prioritized geopolitics, power projection, and anti-communism, while Mexico faced its own internal security imperatives. Mexico's adoption of US policies during the Cold War and later the drug war expanded the state's coercive capacities. These differences often complicated cooperation in these joint counter-narcotics efforts between the United States and Mexico. At times, the United States and Mexico's interests aligned, and at others, they collided, producing tension and often violent consequences. Some of the most contentious episodes where we see on drug policing on the ground emerged in a gray zone where cooperation blurred into contestation. So the 5-chapter narrative revolves around 3 interconnected themes that illuminate the complex story of how militarized narcotics, what it looked like from Mexico. So let's start with externalization. The US faced a domestic drug problem, but instead of addressing it at home, and I mean, this may seem a bit cliche and repetitive, but it continues to be the strategy because instead of addressing it at home, It looked outward for the solutions to these problems. This is the essence of what supply control means, prioritized over demand reduction, which means striking unique deals with foreign partners like Mexico, and at times blaming these foreign countries as the culprits for American overdoses. But in many cases, the United States didn't just ask for cooperation, as we see here in the Mexico case beginning in the in the 1970s. It incentivized and even co-opted Mexico into militarizing drug control. Resources flowed south, but often they did so with strings attached. So this is not to say that Mexico was a passive actor. It was also shaped by a deep concern for its sovereignty, which is sort of a perennial theme in U.S.-Mexico relations basically since 1848. And so, for example, Mexican officials have asserted control by insisting on prosecuting their own traffickers on their own soil. And so to U.S. agents, what does this look like? It looks like corruption, which then creates this vicious cycle of justifying extrajudicial U.S. operations in Mexico and creating a vicious cycle of American interference in Mexico, which then breeds Mexican defensiveness. And then finally, there's force. Between 1969 and 2000, military force became the centerpiece of counternarcotics globally. Yet both Mexico and the United States embraced aggressive enforcement, not just to fight drugs, but to serve broader purposes, including social control, and in at least one case, regime change. And we're seeing questions about that now with the strikes in the Caribbean having to do with Venezuela. And so what began as preventing American overdoses at home evolved into something a lot more sinister abroad. And so this book tells the story, capturing how two nations, each with their own priorities and pressures and consideration, built what can be seen as a collaborative drug war in many cases, even though that collaboration was very much underscored by contestation at times. So one of the key factors shaping the book's periodization is the late 1960s turn toward punitive drug control. And so to understand this shift, let's briefly trace how we got here, because drug control was not inherently punitive. One could argue that states made it that way, and what we see in violence in places like Mexico and other places today is oftentimes a response to the illicit economy protecting its industry. And so if you look at this timeline here, you'll notice that drug control is largely a 20th century story. Before then, the substances we now call drugs were sometimes stigmatized but not criminalized. This changed in the early 1900s, but even then, the earliest US drug policies, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 and the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, were regulatory through taxation, not punitive. This is why the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is the kind of the grandfather organization to the DEA, resided not under the Justice Department, but under the Treasury Department. And for its part, the Mexican Army occasionally destroyed opium or cannabis crops, often with machetes, sometimes flamethrowers. But municipal leaders in Mexico, especially at the state and municipal level, often tolerated production as part of the local economy, especially in periphery states like Sinaloa. And so things really changed then in the 1960s. Mexican drugs began appearing on US city streets, and several forces intensified anti-drug attitudes here at home. Soldiers returning from Vietnam with drug habits, the 1960s counterculture, rising fears of crime and instability. And so this was the moment when mandatory minimums emerged and the DEA moved under the Justice Department. And so against this backdrop, and this is sort of where the book begins, Richard Nixon abruptly closed the southern border in 1969 with Operation Intercept, a crackdown on crime and drug use, which pressured Mexico into adopting more intensive anti-drug measures with US assistance. And so Mexico complied, at least rhetorically, reopening the border after 3 weeks, but it delayed on certain aspects of, like, for example, using herbicides, more aggressively employing the military for years. And now today, I understand that border closures might feel a bit insignificant, especially as we're using tariffs as part of coercive measures to police the border more intensively and what have you. But Intercept was the first border closure, and it was unprecedented at the time in which it occurred. Mexico wasn't even a primary supplier to drugs at this stage. At this point, we're seeing white heroin come into the United States from what the movie popularized as the French Connection route through Asia Minor and Turkey. And so it marked the first time, though, that the United States leveraged the perceived threat of Mexican drugs to restrict cross-border movement. And it was an early chapter in what would become Nixon's war on drugs in 1971. But the core of my research really kind of digs into how Mexico responded to these anti-drug efforts and what its security considerations were. Because south of the border, drugs were not a problem, and my argument is that internal security threats shaped Mexico's drug enforcement strategies. And so to understand the roots of the PRI's repression in Mexico, we must return to the Mexican Revolution, a 10-year conflict that claimed roughly 1.5 million lives and transformed every sector of Mexican society. Its resulting constitution in 1917 promised a democratic and representative government in Mexico, yet the PRI dominated the Mexican presidency and much of the major houses of its government for decades, or for 7 decades, for nearly 70 years. By mid-century, as opposition grew, PRI leaders became fixated on preserving their power. And so outwardly, from the United States perspective, when you compare it with like a Chile or you compare it with like a Guatemala, Mexico projected stability, and there was a huge CIA presence in Mexico City. The PRI also produced modern cities and economic growth, making it a reliable Cold War partner in many ways. But even that Cold War partnership had a lot of considerations and care around it, especially as Mexico had very strong relations with Cuba at certain times during the 1960s and 1970s. Internally, however, PRI agents crushed cycles of peaceful protest demanding democracy. And so the middle chapters of the book trace how Mexico aligned with US security policies, first the Cold War and then the drug war, leveraging these agendas to suppress dissent and expand its military capacities. And so drug enforcement became central to policing because it extended federal authority into peripheral regions, reinforcing the state's reach. And so in some of this, I mean, some might call this a prehistory to understand the phenomena of cartelization, which I'll talk about in just a bit. But I would locate, if we're looking at this early history of Mexico's drug war, we have to examine these spaces where there's lack of state control and the drug trade thrives, and how it was that the Mexican government and its policing institutions were able to respond to these areas. So more on that in just a minute. But a quick note on sources. Bringing together the histories of US counternarcotics and Mexican internal security required extensive research in both countries. And so, as I said earlier, this is a literature dominated by journalistic accounts that only sometimes point to concrete source information. Obviously, more current aspects of this are also difficult to study because of people's safety. This is a very far removed period of time, which I've had to reassure my parents of quite a few times as I was doing this research. And so in writing a historical, more academic book on the topic, I conducted personal interviews from government officials and took advantage of almost full access to Mexican intelligence reports that documented instances of policing, which have now been redacted. So that was something that came into why this project kind of happened as it did. And so as a quick reminder then, so far I've aimed to show how US and Mexican security priorities shape policing, both enabling and straining anti-drug cooperation at certain points in time. Now I want to examine what this looked like and the types of data that I've used to construct this story. And so with that, I'll return to Operation Condor, which I opened up with, which was the US-backed Mexican herbicidal campaign. And so where we left off last, the last thread on this, was in late 1975, 1976, when US heroin use had increased despite Nixon's war on drugs, with Mexico becoming the largest heroin supplier to the United States. And so after Mexico delayed on defoliant use following the 1969 closure, the US pushed for this herbicidal campaign, leading to Operation Condor. But the efforts really, there's a lot of elements that I examine about Condor, but I think that the biggest one is that you could have two partners in drug enforcement doing two very different things in the same operation. And so these efforts expose differing priorities of US and Mexican agents, whereas the US was concerned about what was going on in the air. They wanted to see as much herbicides, as many herbicides sprayed as possible. And when you talk to US officials that were there, they really are not watching what's going on the ground with this large 10,000-man effort that is policing for drugs, but also more so policing for dissent, for anti-party dissent. And so the interaction between drug control and the PRE's repressive efforts manifested in several ways that I look at in describing these types of operations, through geographic overlap, strategic use of aid, contrasting US and Mexican interpretations of the left, and the personnel that were engaged in both of these policing functions. So let me start very quickly with geographic overlap. Both reports from the State Department and Mexican intelligence reports reveal a clear geographic overlap between where the heart of drug policing was and where it was that the PRI was conducting its counterinsurgency campaigns. The Sierra Madre Occidental, which contains Mexico's Golden Triangle, which I put on a triangle right there, includes the states of Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango. And so there was also, by the late 1970s, cultivation spread to Guerrero, which continues to be, at times, a very dangerous place to operate. Guadalajara emerged as sort of the heart of the Mexican drug trade in the 1980s. And there was also some drug production just south of Mexico City in the state of Oaxaca. And so by 1975, the Mexican Army's counterinsurgency in Guerrero had failed, suffering heavy losses against Mexican guerrillas. Yet they were also making major opium seizures. US and Mexican sources indicate that the PRI used US anti-drug resources to tighten control over rural Guerrero, showing how local dynamics was shaping US policy. Guerrilla groups that were operating in these southern parts of Mexico during these anti-drug operations further complicated matters because they were using drugs to get US weapons to fund their efforts against the Mexican government. I also examine how US anti-drug aid bolstered the Mexican Army's capabilities. Though initially reluctant to use herbicides, Mexico accepted weapons and helicopters for Operation Condor and other anti-drug operations. But I've also found that these resources were sometimes repurposed for policing that violated human rights, where we see reports in these intelligence reports that I examine of kidnappings, tortures, and murders. And so US awareness, I mean, the main question you get here is, like, did the US know that this was going on? And so awareness varied by agency. Who the DEA aligned with was very different from who Customs aligned with and who the CIA aligned with. And so you have this sort of oscillation across the US government between complicity and convenient ignorance. So one thing I want to talk about here is that there's sort of two Cold War experiences going on through different meanings of the left, which shaped anti-drug cooperation with the Mexican government, at times conflating elements of what was the Mexican left, which was not necessarily aligned with the Soviet Union as the United States saw the left. But we see a conflation of elements of the Mexican left with users and traffickers of drugs as a justification sometimes for policing them. And so for its part, US officials, as I said, viewed the left as an extension of Soviet communism, even though there wasn't a very strong Soviet communist presence in Mexico. There was a communist presence. I mean, if you visit Frida Kahlo's house, you'll kind of see traces of it in Mexico City, and there was that, but it wasn't overwhelmingly powerful, and it was not connected to Soviet communism. And so while there were some 30-plus student and guerrilla groups in Mexico, some of that embraced socialism and varying degrees of violence against the state, the broader left mostly included students, campesino farmers, teachers, doctors, and workers, voicing their dissent against domestic political repression. But in a time when the Cold War is heavy, when you are a member of the Mexican government, there was a number of documented cases of the Mexican government, saying that these folks were they were the left, they're communists, so that you can justify more aggressive actions against them. And that sort of rationale applied to who was considered a drug trafficker or a user. Oftentimes, these were people that were anti-PRI. And so, despite the lack of cohesion of the Mexican left, the ruling party responded with imprisonment, torture, disappearances, and killings. And really the focus here is how, in constructing a security policy during these years, how Mexican leaders were able to leverage US anxieties, and let's call them obsessions at times, around communism and drug use to secure military aid for its own domestic policing efforts that sometimes had to do with drugs, but many times they didn't. And then finally, the same forces that enforced the PRI's political repression also waged its drug war. And these were soldiers, police, Mexican intelligence agencies, which facilitated the slippage between policing people and policing drugs. And so I traced the careers of a handful of troops who were active at major protests and student disturbances, and then later were active in counterinsurgency operations in southern Mexican states like Guerrero, and then ultimately involved in directing operations like Operation Condor. And so, entangled in the PRI's broader apparatus of repression, Operation Condor served dual purposes shaped by divergent US and Mexican priorities. For Washington, it was about an aerial campaign, which focused on chemically eradicating crops, supporting tougher enforcement, while for the United States, it was an aerial campaign, and a convenient rationale for supporting tougher enforcement while ignoring the local violence and the local fallout. Mexico, by contrast, wielded Condor as a tool of political control in many ways, and so under the guise of drug enforcement, the PRI targeted campesinos, often branding suspected producers as dissidents, and abuses, which are documented in many of these Mexican intelligence reports, extended well beyond narcotics control, reinforcing state repression in many of these peripheral regions. And so a 1977 example, the types of reports that I was able to look at, describe these abuses that come up during Condor's execution. One report describes soldiers raiding campesino homes, stealing food and money, when no drugs were found, committing further abuses, and stealing food. Another report from the same year recounts agents opening fire with machine guns on two campesinos in an ejido, or communal farm, in the southern state of Oaxaca, detaining 40 residents, including women and children. The operations commander justified the violence because he cited finding 100 grams of marijuana on the premises. We also have local media and Mexican intelligence reports that reveal that Condor had significant consequences in terms of violence and the communities that it affected. And so kind of bringing this narrative up to the present, after the operation, herbicidal spraying in northwest Mexico devastated livelihoods by targeting both licit and illicit crops. US and Mexican reports note subsequent migrations to urban centers, where displaced populations became enmeshed in violence between trafficking groups and state forces. And this is what Consul General Matthews was observing at the outset. Punitive enforcement seemed to fail to dismantle the drug trade and had negligible impacts on drug use in the United States. Instead, what happened was that it fostered monopolies of violence as state and criminal actors deployed increasingly sophisticated weaponry against each other. These regions became the cradle of emerging trafficking organizations, including the Guadalajara cartel, which is the precursor or grandfather cartel to today's fragmenting Sinaloa cartel. And so the book traces how today's cartels emerged from the turbulence generated by state actions towards marginalized communities, a dynamic that is only intensified by the execution of militarized drug policy. And so despite these outcomes, aerial spraying persisted for years in countries like Colombia, where leftist insurgency fostered rather complicated state responses. And so post-Condor, Mexican sources report a surge in U.S. agency presence, with intelligence pointing to undercover CIA and DEI operatives embedded in Mexican law enforcement. And so the latter chapters of the book examine how some U.S. agents adopted some of the repressive tactics and torture to question drug traffickers and the ways in which they operated extrajudicially in Mexico, culminating in DEA agent Enrique Camarena's 1985 kidnapping and murder, which was a watershed moment in U.S.-Mexico narcotics diplomacy. And so despite Mexico's attempt to assert its sovereignty in drug enforcement while adopting U.S.-driven counter-narcotics policies in the 1980s and 90s, the government steadily lost control over criminal groups, both to American drug warriors and to domestic trafficking networks. And when we get into the 1990s, this is happening in a period of time when the United States is destroying these trafficking networks in the Caribbean corridor. And that's not diminishing the problem. That's pushing them overland then to make Mexico more senior partners in the drug trade, Mexican drug trafficking organizations, so that they can leverage the border to move their product. And so market forces fuel the drug trade's expansion, compounded by heightened U.S. border security measures aimed at making the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement politically viable in the United States. So it comes as a period where NAFTA really kind of propels, in some ways, the expansion of the Mexican drug trade. And so the violence in Mexico, the more recent violence in Mexico in the 2000s, often appears to have come out of a vacuum detached from broader geopolitical dynamics. However, the book demonstrates how 2 decades of punitive counter-narcotics, NAFTA's open trade bloc, and the U.S. dismantling these Caribbean cocaine networks in the 1990s helped make Mexico the locus of the drug trade in the 2000s. In 2010, Ciudad Juarez was dubbed the murder capital of the world, even as its neighboring city, El Paso, Texas, on the U.S. side, ranked among one of the safest cities, really kind of showing the divides in this drug war, despite the fact that it's fundamentally fueled on U.S. drug demand. And so just reaching conclusion here, I mean, the stark contrast reveals a deeper unresolved narrative about the divergent motives and consequences of militarized drug policy on both sides of the border. A narrative that the book situates within this larger legacy of what the war on drugs means. For the United States, drug policies had focused on substance control, while in Mexico, the reasons for using U.S. mandated drug enforcement differed. It helped to target populations, and it embedded the function of drug policing in these broader systems of political and social repression. U.S. source control efforts in Mexico, though intended to curb supply, were shaped by these domestic logics, often producing violent unintended consequences. And so let me kind of wrap up here with a few points that might transition into further discussion. So number one, the book challenges the view that U.S. militarization was simply imposed on Mexico, revealing that drug control was a flexible pretext for the use of military force. Bilateral enforcement evolved through adaptation and negotiation between U.S. and Mexican agents, Yet US agents sometimes operated extrajudicially, using interrogation methods once deployed against Mexican descent to target traffickers. It raises questions in the history of the war on drugs and what drug policy looks like in our society today about the extent to which drug policing is not always about drugs. It can be a little bit about drugs, but can often encompass broader issues like regime change. It can be used as a policing segments of society, et cetera. Second, long-term American anti-drug policies and Mexico's internal security concerns have fueled kind of a cycle of mutual militarization that persists today, raising questions about burden sharing. I mean, if drugs haven't been eradicated, it could be argued that the Mexican army or the Mexican security agents are failing. And that's an argument that a lot of people espouse. On the one hand, doesn't this rationalize the United States expanding its support or deploying the military to Mexico? But on the other hand, would this support undermine deeper governance challenges of one of our long-standing partners in the longer term? And then finally, aggressive counter-narcotic strategies have largely failed, often worsening the problem as a kind of a main kind of takeaway from the book. The U.S. continues to fund expansive enforcement, while Mexico's militarized model has armed state agents, militias, paramilitaries, and criminal groups, each seeking a monopoly on violence and imposing a sense of order that they themselves undermine. These are complex policy challenges compounded by a thriving illicit economy, stark U.S.-Latin America wealth and security gaps, and almost perpetually high U.S. addiction rates. A more restrained approach, however, does not mean passivity. It does not mean inaction. It prioritizes diplomacy, aid, and multilateral engagement over military force because deploying the military, as we've seen in Mexico for many decades, just hasn't worked. Mexico's 2-decade military campaign against cartels has fueled violence and fragmentation. Colombia has shifted from insurgents to now policing transnational crime. And other places in the region like Brazil, El Salvador, and Ecuador have deployed troops in cities, drawing criticism for excessive force and human rights abuses. And so military-led campaigns risk escalation and these prolonged conflicts that we are probably not, the collective we, the United States, are probably not prepared to be a part of in the longer term. And so sometimes these dynamics, bringing it back to Mexico, make headlines here in the United States, but oftentimes they do not. And so by looking at this historical prehistory, or by looking at this historical narrative, this prehistory of the war on drugs, if you will, it's pushing for that only by understanding the forces sustaining Mexico's insecurity and counter-narcotics failures in the longer term, can we then begin to be at the stage where we're crafting more effective, lasting solutions. And I will leave you with that. Thank you so much. So I am told that people can ask questions or share ideas, and so I would love to talk with you about this. And if no one has questions, that's okay too. Oh, you got a microphone coming. Olivia's on one side, Alejandro is on the other, and so yeah.
Thank you, very interesting talk and wonderful work. Could you speak a little bit more about the Mexican executive military campaigns, how they've shifted from Calderon on, and the relationship with U.S. Operations at the same time?
Absolutely, and that's a very outstanding and pertinent question. Thank you, Nancy. I mean, the Calderon years were associated with the implementation of a drug war, the government taking on, mobilizing resources to take on the drug cartels, and this produced infighting between criminal groups, which is what we saw with Ciudad Juarez in 2010 being this terribly horrific, violent place. Since then, we had the presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto, who came in after him from 2012 to 2018. And he sought to distance himself from Felipe Calderon's drug war, kind of pulling back from that violence. But what we saw was that slowly violence started to spike again, but away from the border and deeper into Mexico. Today, Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, would blame the drug war and the current state of the drug war on, right now she's blaming it on the Calderon and the Peña Nieto years. And we always have someone to blame. But to kind of bring the narrative up to the present, then we had López Obrador, AMLO's policies of hugs, not bullets, which this was the government. He completely disbanded the federal police. He put all of his eggs into the basket of a non-militarized National Guard. And the National Guard, I mean, it was at one point in 2020, it had more human rights abuses on record than the Mexican military. So eventually, by the end of López Obrador's presidency, 2023, 2024, he wanted to move the National Guard under the military. It's just like, what do we do that for? And then finally, we put President Sheinbaum coming in, and I mean, her approach is mixed right now because largely she was responding to she came into office, we didn't really know what her security policy was going to be because, I mean, we were waiting for López Obrador to retire to his hacienda in Tabasco and for her to kind of start leading front and center and get away from his support. But then once she finally started to assert her autonomy and independence, then we start to see the coercive tariff pressures from the Trump administration. And so we didn't really have enough time to see what her strategy would be. In the last month, there have been both a politician and an agricultural activist that have been killed. So Sheinbaum's administration has said that, you know, in the first 6 months of this year, homicides have decreased as compared to the year before. However, these high-profile murders seem to undermine the fact that it's, you know, that high-profile people are still being killed. And ironically, Felipe Calderon launched his war on drugs from the state of Michoacan, and that's exactly right now where Claudia Sheinbaum is launching her next operation. So it's like, I mean, it's just back, hopefully not back to square one.
Howdy, Dr. Teague.
Howdy.
I have two questions, if I'm allowed. One, how effective has the Kingpin strategy been? And the second one is the Merida initiative that George Bush enacted, is that still in effect, and what does that look like now?
Yeah, great questions. So the Merida initiative was modeled off of Plan Colombia, which, I mean, these are billions of dollars that are being funneled to beef up the military and to institute some kind of reform against the cartels. So it lasted through about 2020, and then López Obrador, who I was just talking about with this hugs not bullets strategy, kind of pulled out of it. So it no longer exists. And it evolved into this what's called the bicentennial framework. But nobody's really kind of manned the bicentennial framework. It's just been around saying, we're going to do root causes, we're going to focus on the military a bit. And all these other things have happened in the meantime. And so the type of aid that was coming into Mexico from the United States from the George W. Bush administration until about 2020 largely is not active right now. And so hopefully somebody is going to resurrect the bicentennial framework and put it front and center, but all these other things have happened, and then you have Republicans talking about sending military force into Mexico, and Sheinbaum is forced to respond in a lot of different ways. So it's really kind of taking our eye off the ball of like these long-term strategic measures that we really need to talk about at some point. And then, I'm sorry, your other question, that was the Merida Initiative, and what was the other one?
The Kingpin strategy.
The Kingpin strategy. Okay, so really good question. I think the Kingpin strategy takes the form of has many faces. Because in some ways, the strikes, or the USS Gerald Ford and the other ships and stuff, and the troops mobilized are intended to kind of take out big narco kingpins, as you say, and that's been the strategy since the days of Pablo Escobar in Colombia in the 1980s. And I think what we've seen in the Mexico case is that it tends to breed more infighting. Even just now, the Sinaloa cartel used to be top dog for so long, and we've arrested not El Chapo, but his other associates. We've arrested a few of them, and now the cartel is fragmented. Half of them are sort of allied with the new big dog, which is the Jalisco Nuevo Nación Nueva Generación cartel, and the others are kind of forming their own faction, and that's why Sinaloa right now is really violent. And so, I mean, I think that example can be replicated you can find a lot of evidence that sort of thing has happened, and so that would be my long answer of saying that the kingpin strategy is still alive and well, but I don't think it's working.
Hi, Dr. Teague. I know as a Mexican citizen and somebody who previously lived on the border, see the Sheinbaum and AMLO administrations as kind of an extension of the PRI. I was wondering if during your research you found any sort of interruption in the Mexican policy when the PAN under Vicente Fox's administration came around in 2000 to 2006. So if you saw any sort of major change there before maybe reverting back to classic PRI strategy.
Yeah, good question and a really important point. I mean, so your question is whether or not there was a big change in, well, I mean, one way to answer the question would be that the 12 years that the PAN was in power between 2000 and 2012, we have this period in which some people would argue that the PRI actually kept drug traffickers at bay, and there's this term called the Pax Priista, which basically means that there was this unprecedented period of peace during PRI rule because they had agreements with criminal groups that they wouldn't attack the big cities, they wouldn't attack people's families, but those kinds of agreements were completely shattered when Vicente Fox became president in 2000, and then of course you put Felipe Calderon on there, who all out takes on the cartels with the military like that. Those are huge changes, right? But I think that you bring up a more important political point of whether or not some of these new parties and new political movements in Mexico are fundamentally new, or if they're just sort of relics from the past. I mean, one could argue that right now with Morena, which is Mexico's dominant party, I mean, it's operating, it's affecting, it's undermining national elections as it reaches a supermajority. And so many people have leveled, as you're saying, these kinds of accusations that Morena is just as dictatorial as the PRI was. I mean, I don't know, because I think it'll be interesting, and we need to see what Sheinbaum's rule is going to kind of, how much she's going to kind of craft her own way away from López Obrador, and then how much the opposition parties really kind of respond. Right now, the PAN and the Movimiento Ciudadano, which is sort of like this weird relic of bits of the PRI, they kind of need to get their act together as opposition parties if they're going to kind of run interference against Morena, and we'll see what happens in 5 more years in the next cycle of elections.
At Operation Condor, we really don't have a lot of control when you give the money or the military equipment to Mexico, what they're going to use it for. We wanted it to be used against anti-drug. The Mexican government wanted to use it to control their opposition. Following from that to the military operations that are happening now against from the American, I think it's George Washington, whatever the carrier group that's down there that's taking out the boats. At what point, how many Americans do we have to, you talked about we're not controlling the people wanting the drugs. And I understand that, but that's a whole nother topic. But if you don't try and control the supply, and with closing the border and with blowing these ships up, it's changing what's going on down there. You talked about the 2 politicians that have been killed. There's actually been 26 down to governors and politicians running in the last year that have been murdered in Mexico. So I don't know that President Sheinbaum is necessarily anti-drug at this point, because there's a huge number of politicians and journalists being killed in Mexico, in this last year. So I just offer that up and request your comment.
Sure, no. I mean, I said 2 politicians were, or a politician and an agricultural activist were killed in the last month. I mean, electoral violence is predominant, and it extends far beyond 26 people this year. And so it's a travesty, and there's other offshoots of that, femicide, et cetera. And what you raise is a really difficult question here, because if these foreign counterparts can't keep their house in order, what's to say that that U.S. military force or U.S. military capabilities shouldn't aid in fixing the problem. And so you might not want to be interventionist or resurrect these old kind of gunboat diplomacy type ways of thinking in Latin American countries, but there's a compelling argument to make that we have no other choice. And I can 100% understand that argument, and I can see why it's compelling. But also, I think that the ways in which it's articulated in the media at times go against. They overstep. This is a partner. This is a partner nation. This is not a rogue nation that we're dealing with. This is a partner nation of the United States. And so, these sort of threats of unilateral military force completely undermine diplomacy. And in the whole legacy of what it is that we study here at the Bush School with effective diplomacy and kind of mastering that before going to militarized solutions, I don't think that we should be going there that quickly. The people that are touting the use of military force are not exploring other solutions first. And I'm not even saying that coercive diplomacy is off the table. I will say that for President Trump, the tariffs, imposing the tariffs on Mexico, it got Mexico to it whipped Mexico into shape in a way that wasn't military intervention. And so I wonder what kinds of ways there are in doing that while respecting sovereignty. The other case would be in Venezuela, that there are other partners in South America that have offered to kind of help mediate the situation with Venezuela that are also very strong on drugs, Lula da Silva in Brazil being one of them. But we're still deploying the USS Gerald Ford to the Caribbean. And so it's just looking at how we can not go to military force, so quickly, because the Mexico case shows us that we have, and it produced consequences, and a long-term occupation of the military in Mexico. The Mexico receives training, and I can say this by U.S. Marine Corps forces north. It's not like they're just sort of alone and unafraid. There are extensive military partnerships in place. So this is not just a rogue, far away military force that's completely divorced or not partnered with U.S. counterparts. And so it's just kind of coming back and thinking of solutions that foster some degree of diplomacy and partnership first before strikes and deploying troops.
First question I have is, when you mention herbicides used in Mexico, is that the same Agent Orange that caused so many problems for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Agent Orange was not used in Mexico in these things, but it was P4. I forgot what it was. I don't remember the number as well. It's like P2D, but there's two elements to that, because with Agent Orange, it was based off of it was not Agent Orange. Some conspiracy theorists want to tell you it's Agent Orange, but there was also really interesting stories that you had marijuana that was sprayed with some of these herbicides. It could be cultivated within 24 hours, and so a lot of the traffickers then would go in and very quickly cultivate the sprayed marijuana, and then it ended up in the United States. And so people were having lung issues, and so the U.S. forces Mexico to use these herbicides. It initially doesn't want to, then it uses them, then it's sprayed on marijuana. The marijuana is very quickly harvested. It's brought into the United States, and then you have people asking for protection for the U.S. government because their lungs are hurting and because they're having early onsights of lung cancer. So it's just very kind of warped the way in which this story works. But to bring it back to your original question, it wasn't Agent Orange. It was P4D, and another one that is used in low concentrations in agriculture around the world, but the issue of it is it being applied in blanket concentrations to cause damage, which we don't use it in that capacity.
Since we've legalized marijuana throughout much of the United States, has that had much of an effect on the Mexico thing? Also, in Portugal, it seemed like years ago, said drugs are okay. How did that work out? Do you-
Yeah.
if you know.
Portugal's a great case, and it's worked out for them. They, you know, in terms of legalizing, I think it's a smaller country. There's less of an inherent drug problem than there is here, and they experimented for a while with these, you know, with harm reduction and other type measures before they legalized. I mean, here, some people, I don't know if that would be politically palatable, because I mean, here, take Oregon, who tried to initially do that, and you know, it was this kind of like cool place. If you look at Portland, and after a while, there was an even larger homeless population, more drug addiction, you know, than before. And so I don't know that legalization in our society would be politically or sort of socially palatable, but it's something that's interesting to talk about. I think decriminalization is probably more realistic. Really important questions you ask about the emergence of the marijuana industry, sort of the bread and the butter. I think it's an important step towards having a more honest conversation about drug use and what addiction is in US society. But in terms of reducing the profits of Mexico's trafficking groups, it's done very little, because it's predicated more on fentanyl, and to a lesser extent, methamphetamines and cocaine. Oh, last question.
Quick. This may be outside the temporal domain of your book.
All right.
But with the Trump administration's emphasis on border control, has this led to a corresponding decrease in support for military efforts in Mexico? Are we seeing a shift over the past year of this is Mexico's problem now and we're not going to help?
That's a great question. I don't think so. I mean, I don't think much has changed, save for the fact that I think the migration questions are very much kind of weaved into this. I don't think that there's been much support for using the military inside Mexico. I think that most people want, you know, Sheinbaum to, you know, shift away from the hugs not bullets type stuff of her predecessor and have a more cohesive security strategy and have, you know, measured outcomes. But I don't know that there's any relation of that to the border clampdown, which is a really interesting issue in and of itself. Good. All right. Well, I'm told that we are at time. So thank you again for coming, and thanks for your questions.